What if the story Vladimir Putin tells about his family isn't the full story? According to Putin himself, his grandfather once cooked for Lenin and Stalin, placing the family at the very heart of Soviet power. It's a powerful origin story. But here's the problem. There is surprisingly little evidence to prove it. And yet, that version of the past has been repeated for years. So what is real? A hidden dynasty that has been close to power for generations, or a carefully constructed narrative shaped by a man who built his life around control, secrecy, and influence? Because when it comes to Vladimir Putin, the line between history and story is not always clear. The story begins with a man named Spiridon Putin, a cook by profession. But according to Vladimir Putin, not just any cook. He claimed his grandfather prepared meals for both Lenin and Stalin, two of the most powerful figures in Soviet history. If true, it would mean the Putin family was quietly connected to power from the very beginning. Close enough to be trusted, close enough to be invisible. But when historians looked into it, the picture became less clear. Records are limited, details are vague. Yes, Spiridon Putin likely worked as a cook, but how close he really was to the Soviet leadership remains uncertain. And that uncertainty matters, because if the foundation of the story is blurred, everything built on top of it becomes harder to define. If this story were true, it would place the Putin family close to power from the very beginning. But what do you think? Is this a genuine family legacy, or the beginning of a carefully shaped narrative? Let me know your view below. Unlike many historic dynasties, the Putins did not rise from privilege. They came from survival. Vladimir Putin was born into a family shaped by war, loss, and hardship. His father had fought in the Second World War and returned injured. Two of his parents' children died young. The family lived in a small shared apartment in post-war Leningrad, a city still scarred by siege, hunger, and destruction. There was little space, little comfort, and even less certainty. This was not an environment that produced aristocrats. It produced resilience, and in many ways, it also produced a mindset, one shaped by instability, caution, and the constant need to stay in control. Because in a world like that, weakness was not an option. As he grew older, Putin found his path into one of the most powerful institutions of the Soviet state, the KGB. He studied law, joined the Communist Party, and entered a world built on intelligence, secrecy, and control. But it was not just the system that shaped him, it was what happened next. In the 1980s, Putin was stationed in East Germany, a front line of the Cold War. From there, he witnessed something few insiders ever expected: the collapse of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. The system he had committed himself to began to fall apart. For many, it was a moment of liberation. For others, it was chaos, loss, weakness. And for Putin, it appears to have been something else entirely, a lesson. That power, once lost, is not easily regained. And this is where the story really starts to get interesting. When Putin returned to Russia in the early 1990s, the country itself was collapsing. The Soviet Union was gone. The economy was in chaos. Power was up for grabs. It was in this uncertainty that Putin began to rise. First in St. Petersburg, working under reformist mayor Anatoly Sobchak, then quietly moving into Moscow, into the inner structures of the new Russian state. Step by step, position by position, he moved closer to the center of power, until, suddenly, he was no longer in the background. In 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigned. And in a move that surprised many, he named Putin as his successor, an unknown figure, now in control of one of the most powerful countries in the world. In his early years in power, Putin was not seen as a threat. Russia's economy began to recover. After years of chaos, many people experienced something they had not felt in a long time: stability. Wages rose. The state regained control. And for many Russians, life became more predictable again. Internationally, he was often viewed as pragmatic, a leader who could work with the West. But at the same time, something else was happening. Power was becoming more centralized, political opposition grew weaker, and the space for independent voices began to narrow. Supporters saw order being restored, critics saw control being consolidated, and the line between the two became increasingly difficult to define. The war in Ukraine is often seen as the clearest expression of Putin's worldview. But what that worldview actually is depends on who you ask. For some, this is not simply about territory. It is about influence, security, and Russia's place in a shifting global order. Critics argue that Putin is attempting to reassert control over regions that were once part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Others see it differently, as a response to NATO expansion and a perceived pressure on Russia's strategic sphere. At the same time, his leadership inside Russia continues to draw attention. Supporters point to stability and strength. Critics highlight growing centralization of power and a narrowing political space. Whether these internal dynamics are directly connected to Russia's actions abroad remains a matter of debate. These events are interpreted very differently depending on perspective. So, where do you stand? Do you see strategy, security, or something more? I'm curious how you see it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Beyond politics, Putin's private life remains largely hidden. For decades, he was married. Before, a carefully managed divorce in 2014. Since then, reports about relationships have circulated widely, most notably involving former Olympic gymnast Alina Kabaeva. None of this has ever been fully confirmed. There are also persistent claims that Putin may have additional children beyond his two publicly known daughters. His daughters themselves have taken a different path, both holding influential roles in science and research, but largely staying out of public politics. Then there is the question of wealth. Officially, his income appears modest, yet for years, analysts have suggested that his real wealth could be far greater, hidden through networks of assets and allies. Luxury residences, a vast estate on the Black Sea, even private yachts, all widely reported, yet never fully transparent. And that, perhaps, is the point. So what is the Putin dynasty, really? There are relatives, connections, and circles of influence. But unlike traditional dynasties, power in this system does not visibly pass through a family. It concentrates around one man. From a childhood shaped by hardship, to the discipline of the KGB, to the sudden rise in a collapsing state, Putin's story is not one of inherited power. It is one of constructed power. A system built, step by step, around control, loyalty, and influence. Which brings us back to the question, is this a true dynasty or something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want to understand how power really works behind the scenes, subscribe to the Dynasty Code.